Welcome back to The Explainer. You know, whenever we see those breaking headlines about global climate treaties, net zero carbon goals, or even just these crazy modern heat wave records, the diplomatic framework for literally all of it traces back to one singular event. Today, we are unpacking the 1992 Earth Summit. This was absolutely the catalyst for modern global climate action. So if you've ever wondered where the actual foundations for today's sustainability efforts were laid and why they're so massively significant, well, this is it. Let's get right into it.
Okay, let's dive into this, because this number is just staggering. 108. That's the number of heads of state and government who gathered in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, for this summit. I mean, up until that point in history, it was entirely unprecedented to have that many world leaders in one place, specifically to discuss the environment on a global scale. It sent a massive signal, right? Environmental issues were no longer this fringe topic. They had suddenly reached the absolute highest levels of geopolitical importance.
To understand how this whole thing unfolded, here's our roadmap. We're going to look at a monumental global gathering, blueprints for the planet, defining sustainable development, the North-South divide, and finally, the legacy of Rio.
Section 1. A monumental global gathering. The post-Cold War environmental push.
So, picture this. It's the brief post-Cold War window of 1992, and the world is actually looking for new ways to cooperate. From June 3rd to the 14th, Rio de Janeiro literally became the center of the world. We're talking 172 governments and over 2,400 non-governmental organizations officially represented. That's huge. But beyond just the hard numbers, the atmosphere was completely electric and just full of intense contrasts. You had these highly educated diplomats speeding by in air-conditioned limousines guarded by soldiers, while tens of thousands of citizens and activists were marching through the streets demanding action. The entire world was uniting to tackle sustainability issues that were simply way too big for any single nation to handle alone.
And this brilliantly illustrates the real triumph of this gathering, a massive shift in perspective. Maurice Strong, who was the Secretary General of the summit, noted that previously the environment and the economy were often treated as, completely separate issues, like two different worlds. But at Rio, the global conversation shifted fundamentally. They successfully linked environmental degradation directly to economic underdevelopment and poverty. The prevailing thought became super clear. You couldn't possibly solve one without addressing the other.
Section 2. Blueprints for the Planet. The Treaties of Rio.
So, what actually came out of all these high-level negotiations? At first glance, it kind of looks like a dense alphabet soup of UN jargon, but let's break it down into functional pieces. The summit resulted in a few key non-binding documents. First up, Agenda 21. This was a massive 900-page blueprint for global sustainability that seriously makes modern software terms and conditions look remarkably short. Then there was the Rio Declaration, outlining the rights and responsibilities of states, along with the Forest Principles. But crucially, it also opened two legally binding agreements for signature, the UNFCCC for climate change and the CBD for biological diversity.
Looking at this milestone IUCN guide, we can really see why the CBD was such a landmark treaty. For the very first time, global policy took a comprehensive rather than isolated approach to the Earth's ecosystems. It wasn't just about saving one specific animal anymore. It formally recognized that biological resources had to be conserved not just for human survival, but for reasons of ethics, intrinsic value, and long-term economic benefit. A real game changer.
And then there was the UNFCCC. Its primary objective was monumental, right there in black and white, to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere. This treaty was the absolute bedrock. It laid the groundwork, intended to prevent dangerous human interference with the climate system. And honestly, that is an objective that continues to drive international climate negotiations to this very day.
Section 3. Defining Sustainable Development. The core philosophy.
So, the crucial point is that the philosophical anchor of the entire summit came down to a definition originally popularized by the Brundtland Commission. Let's read it together. Sustainable development. Development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. It sounds super familiar, almost simple to us now, right? But back in 1992, fully integrating this framework into international policy was genuinely revolutionary.
The summit was driven by this really powerful, almost fragile realization. Our generation has a profound duty. It's like we owe this massive debt to the future. We have to respect the preferences of inherently unknown future generations, as well as the countless other species that, frankly, simply have no voice at the negotiating table. It was a profound acknowledgement that humanity is resting delicately on the natural world.
To actually execute this philosophy, the summit produced Agenda 21.
Now, it's really important to understand that this was a voluntary, non-binding program. It represented shared global aspirations. Instead of enforcing strict international laws, it was designed more as a guide to democratize natural resource management. The goal? To alleviate poverty, hunger, and sickness worldwide, while simultaneously halting the deterioration of the global ecosystems that sustain us all.
Section 4. The North-South Divide. A clash of perspectives.
Let's move to and see how this builds, because as harmonious as sustainable development sounds, the reality of implementing it caused some intense friction. There was a tremendous clash of perspectives between the industrialized North and the developing South. The North was heavily focused on reducing global emissions and, notably, protecting their intellectual property. In fact, the U.S. initially refused to sign the Biodiversity Convention over concerns it would hurt their biotechnology industry's profits. Meanwhile, the developing South was focused on poverty alleviation and securing financial aid to transition their economies. Leaders in the global South genuinely feared that these new environmental rules were just a form of eco-imperialism, basically a way for the wealthy North to essentially pull up the development ladder right behind them.
And all of this tension crystallized around a truly staggering number, $625 billion. That was the estimated annual financing required for the global South to meet these new sustainability goals. Yet the United States, Europe, and Japan pledged only about $6 to $7 billion in new aid. To put that into perspective, that is just about 1% of the total costs. This massive gap highlighted a severe lack of distributive justice that deeply, deeply frustrated many developing nations.
Now, what's really interesting about this is how the non-governmental organizations viewed this divide. In their Alternative Poverty Treaty, they argued that the centralization of power to control natural resources causes simultaneously poverty and environmental degradation. You see, for the thousands of NGOs at the Parallel Global Forum, the root of the crisis wasn't just physical pollution, it was procedural equity. They argued that until political and economic decision-making was decentralized, true sustainability would literally be impossible.
Section 5. The Legacy of Rio. The Foundation of Climate Diplomacy.
So what did this monumental yet imperfect summit actually leave behind? Looking at this timeline, it is completely clear that the 1992 Earth Summit is ground zero for climate diplomacy. By giving birth to the UNFCCC, Rio directly sparked the ongoing conferences of the parties, or COPs, that totally dominate international news today. Think about it. Without Rio in '92, there's no COP1 in Berlin in 1995. There's no Kyoto Protocol in 1997, there are no Cancun agreements in 2010, and for sure, no Paris Agreement years later. The Earth Summit laid the exact procedural track that the entire world still runs on.
And it wasn't just governments whose legacy was forged here. Parallel to the main event, young people organized the Youth 92 conference. Even back then, young participants were organizing, fighting for their voice, and expressing deep dissatisfaction with the slow rate of change. The official documents even noted that the involvement of youth was absolutely critical to the long-term success of Agenda 21, because, after all, it is quite literally their future that was being negotiated.
Which leaves us with this final, pressing question. Over 30 years after the Earth Summit, with all the blueprints drawn and treaties signed, are we actually meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own? The 1992 Earth Summit gave us the framework, the language, and the institutions to fight for a sustainable planet. But the work to actually fulfill that promise, well, that is still entirely up to us. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope it sparked your curiosity to learn even more about our shared global history. See you next time.